15.1 is a notice of motion from Councillor Baxter on the decriminalisation of sex work. And so we've received one request from the public to speak to this item. I'd like Miss Lisa Dallimore, please, to come forward. Welcome. Please state your name and suburb.
Lisa Dallimore, Northcote, but a former resident of Port Phillip. I'm here from Sex Work Law Reform Victoria and as an individual with lived experience of sex work to speak in support of Councillor Baxter's motion. Our organisation, Sex Work Law Reform Victoria, is a volunteer lobby group supporting the full decriminalisation of sex work in Victoria. Until very recently, I was a sex worker, and I do still volunteer and work with sex workers in Port Phillip. And unanimously, sex workers support the full decriminalisation of sex work. The City of Port Phillip is an important government area when it comes to this conversation because the largest concentration of street-based sex workers is here in this area. The largest number of licensed brothels in Victoria is here in this area. And the second largest number of private or independent sex workers live here in Port Phillip as well. So a goodly number of the good people of Port Phillip are engaged with sex work in one respect or another. So as a former sex worker, this motion rings true to me and what our organisation is fighting for, because decriminalisation is critical to ensuring the safety, equality and justice for sex workers. And we say that all sex workers must feel comfortable and free to report crimes against them to the police and not be inhibited from doing so for fear of being criminalised or arrested themselves. So that's why decriminalisation is so important. And we maintain that sex workers work, and we maintain that there should not be a set of criminal laws controlling what consenting adults do in private. So on behalf of the vibrant and diverse sex working community of Port Phillip, I just want to thank Councillor Baxter for putting forward this motion. Thank you, Madam Mayor and Councillors.
Thank you very much, Ms Dallimore, for coming out tonight. So before I ask Councillor Baxter to move this notice of motion, I'd like to give councillors the opportunity to ask questions of the officers in regard to this proposed notice of motion. Any questions, councillors? Now, Councillor Baxter, would you like to move this notice of motion?
I sure would.
Well, let's hear what his motion is, and
sure.
then we'll ask for a seconder, Councillor
Eager beaver over here, but thank you, Councillor Gross. But so I, Councillor Tim Baxter, give notice that I intend to move this motion. That Council 1 notes that the Victorian Government has launched a review into decriminalisation of sex work. There has not been a significant review of regulation regarding sex work since 1985, the year I was born. There have been significant changes to the way sex work is conducted, and that existing regulations have not kept pace with these changes. While the current laws allow for a minority of sex workers to work legally, the majority of sex work still remains criminalised. Criminalisation of sex work continues to pose a significant threat to the health and well-being of people engaged in sex work, including those who are most marginalised. 2, reaffirms Council's commitment to decriminalisation of sex work as the best means of ensuring health and safety of people engaged in sex work and of providing the best public health outcomes for the community. 3, requests that officers prepare a submission to the review into decriminalisation of sex work on behalf of Council, and this submission be brought to Council for endorsement.
Thank you. Councillor Gross, you were keen to second. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Baxter?
I would. Thank you, Madam Mayor. And thank you.
Ask a technical question of an officer, or are we too late?
Yes. Is it a clarifying question at this point, Councillor Brand? Is it a clarifying question? think your time has passed for that answer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, look, the reason why I'm moving this motion is that not too long ago I met with current and former sex workers from the Sex Work Law Reform Victoria group, but I have also met at various times over my term with current and former sex workers who have advocated and want to discuss the impact of the criminalisation of sex work. So what we know, not only from the workers themselves but from health experts, is that the current criminal nature of the work that sex workers do is harmful to sex workers who live and or work in Port Phillip, among other places. But certainly it's a massive issue locally, as the Speaker just before noted. We disproportionately host a number of brothels in this area, whether licensed or otherwise, as well as street sex workers and simply residents who engage in sex work. So what we also know from health experts and examples of international best practice is that decriminalising their work and removing the stigma of sex work will allow sex workers to access necessary services, including health services, and those of the police without fear. That stigma and that fear of being charged or fined is a significant impact on people being able to access the services they need to access. So decriminalisation will mean that sex workers will not be afraid to report assaults, for example, and we should be able to see associated harm reduction in that respect. Now, the City of Port Phillip has a proud history in this area and, in fact, has already advocated for decriminalisation in the past. So this is simply restating the position given the Victorian government review so that we can make a submission to that effect and to continue our good work in harm minimisation advocacy that we have been doing for a very, very long time. So in conclusion, this work it's the oldest profession in the world, and the practitioners should be given the respect and freedom that all workers should enjoy, and that starts with making their work no longer a crime.
Thank you. Councillor Gross.
So, fellow councillors, I'm going to talk about 3 dates in 2013, 2002 and then forward to 2020. In 2013, Tracy Connolly, a sex worker, was murdered in the most horrific circumstances in Grieve Street. The community was absolutely shocked, both by the nature of the murder, but the way and protracted way it occurred. There was nothing good about this. Tracy's death was greeted sort of commendably by the community. There were huge demonstrations about the safety, and a memorial service was held in Grieve Street with candlelights. The community looked really good. But one thing it meant for me was, there were 2 things. First of all, street sex work can be incredibly dangerous, fatally dangerous. And secondly, on that evening, I've never been more angry in my life, in my municipal life, because politician after politician stood up, mouthed declarations of regret and cowardice in that they would not embrace the sort of difficult conversations and legislation that is needed to ensure that sex workers are both free and safe. It was a night for the mouthing of empty platitudes, and I was beside myself with rage. Let's go back 2002, AGSPAG, the Attorney General's street Prostitution Advisory Group run by this council with the committee, with the state government, chaired by Minister Dick Wynne. He wasn't a minister then. Once again, the argument about street sex work was that the only way you can maximise safety is to break down the ambiguity of trying to protect vulnerable people who are doing something illegal. And that ambiguity meant that the police were forever unable to effectively police for the safety of sex workers. They had to police for the safety of sex workers and the rules of prohibition. It was a clear example where prohibition led to an increase in the lack of safety. AGSPAG recommended tolerance zones, a form of partial decriminalisation, and of course the community affected by the proposed tolerance zones were scared and angry, and that led to governments withdrawing their permission to look at decriminalisation. Once again, a moment of impotence and anger for me as a municipal person. This time I was part of the whole process. Let's fast forward now to 2020. So 2020 is a particular opportunity for us because sex work has moved from the streets to online. And what that means is that the amenity impacts on residents in both the pickup zones and the servicing zones has starkly diminished. And we can have a long and gentle conversation about reversing some of the traffic treatments that were designed to move a completely useless policy that was designed to move the trade on. And I recommend that we have that conversation because there's no need to disrupt our streets in the way they are. So with this transition from the streets to the net, we see an increase in safety. Sex work is still not safe. There are still reports of assaults. But the way to make sex work less intrusive on residents and safer for the practitioners is to allow freedom to practice that vocation and to practice it not on the street, to practice it without the problem of a prohibition, and to protect residents by encouraging this transition to the net with a safe, legal way of practicing. So I think that this is a virtuous time to be looking at this, and the benefit for the residents is absolutely palpable, and the freedom and benefit for sex workers is equally palpable. It's, I commend the Deputy Mayor on this notice of motion, and I urge us all to allow this basic freedom to practice a vocation in safety to proceed.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Councillor Brand.
Yes, I commend the motion. I want to make a few observations about how I think it needs to be interpreted in some detail, but I do remember the times in 2002 that Councillor Gross talks about, and discussing the tolerance zones with the local community was a fairly gruelling task. I sat in many, many living rooms of many people with community meetings in people's houses, discussing it, explaining it. It was a big and drawn out campaign, and it was difficult. I really still stand, generally speaking, with the policies that we developed back then, which are mentioned in the supporting information here. When the motion itself says we reaffirm Council's commitment to decriminalisation of sex work, I stand by that too. I hope that this doesn't mean that we go directly to adopt the policy that we had 18 years ago and just go with that. It needs review, it needs updating, it needs to be critiqued and looked at again properly in the light of the current day and in light of the things that we've learnt since then, unintended consequences it might have, the completely different sort of structure of the way the industry works at the moment. All these things need to be looked at, and I hope that part 3 of this motion, which is to request that officers prepare a submission, is that it is prepared, I think, with our basic intention and belief in harm minimisation and decriminalisation in this case as a major step to harm minimisation, but to actually do a fresh task, a fresh go at getting this right along those lines. I think there are lots of things that we can get wrong. We have to be very careful here. But assuming that, I certainly support it and thank Councillor Baxter for raising it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councillor Simic?
Thank you, Councillor Baxter, for bringing this motion. And I completely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think it's imperative on us to put in a submission into this process, and I hope that the experiences of people with lived experience and the voices of people with lived experience can be amplified in our submission as well. At the end of the day, we have to do what we can to ensure the health and well-being of people in our municipality, but also look at Victoria more broadly, take leadership on issues like this, and make sure that violence against people who are sex workers is not in any way tolerated. I just shocked hearing and being reminded again of the accounts that Councillor Gross talked about. So I wholeheartedly support this motion. Thank Councillor Baxter for bringing it, and all the words that have been said by councillors on this topic tonight. Already I agree wholeheartedly.
Any further? Councillor Copsey.
Councillor Simic just said everything I was going to say, but I just wanted to echo the thanks to Councillor Baxter for bringing this motion, and that it was excellent to hear perspective of lived experience. I hope that those are elevated through the review, and I would urge officers as they work on this submission to consider whether we can include lived experience perspectives within our council's submission as well. Thank you very much.
Councillor Pearl.
Thanks, Mayor. Just want to thank... sorry, I've forgotten your name. Lisa. Thanks for coming this evening. It's quite brave, and thank you for your service to the community more generally. So I won't say anything more about that, but just thanks for sharing your experience. It's a brave thing to do, and we appreciate you coming here this evening and sharing it with us. It opened my eyes. I'm not an expert on this area and far from it, but there's two sides to the story in terms of the supply and demand side, and the supply side gets a lot of focus in the media and not enough focus in terms of education around the demand side, in terms of why people feel the need to step outside the relationships in particular and engage with these services. It's an area, a sector I don't know a lot about other than hearing news reports, and I was in the car listening to one last week which horrified me, where a legal brothel owner was charged with forcing someone to do what he described as training activities. This is a pretty seedy world, even in the legalised area, which really is not not well covered in our society and not well focused on. So it's good that there's being focused on it. I don't support the motion because I don't know a lot about this area, so it's not evidence-based particularly, because I haven't sat and researched it, and a lot of people here, and it's good to learn from the experience of councillors. I've been on council for some time when this issue was a hot-button issue in the early 2000s. But the reason I don't support it is I don't agree with normalising
this activity in our society. And a lot of you will disagree with that, and I understand your arguments against it, but that's my core belief and where I stand. So I'll vote against the motion, but respect and understand the arguments that you've put forward to support it.
Deputy Mayor, would you like to close?
I would. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I've had some councillors thank me, but I would actually like to thank Councillor Gross, who Councillor Gross and I met with Ms Dallimore and some other advocates not too long ago, and I know that Councillor Gross has been working on this for a while, so I wanted to make sure that I didn't finish up speaking before I had acknowledged Councillor Gross's role. I'd also like to thank Ms Dallimore for coming down and speaking to us and for her advocacy. I think that hearing from people who that work in this industry and that actually know what they're talking about is really important when we're discussing these things. It can often turn into just a bunch of people, with no experience of this world making decisions about it. So it's really important to centre those people that are most affected by these decisions. I acknowledge the contribution of Councillor Pearl, who talked about not understanding the kind of people that utilise these services, and just as an example, some of the people that I've spoken to, both sex workers and people who purchase those services, they can often be single people who are very lonely. I've heard from quite a few people who have disabilities who find that sharing comfort and intimacy with people, whether sexual or not, is something that is difficult to get, and they find the need to pay for that service. It's not just a matter of cheating spouses. This is something that many people utilise, and I wouldn't want to judge anyone for making the decisions that they make. I also just wanted to not finish up without mentioning some of the stuff that Councillor Gross mentioned around street sex work in our municipality. Although most, I'm not sure, but quite a lot of sex work has moved from the street in Port Phillip to online, from discussions with people like the Gatehouse, who are an amazing organisation working with street sex workers in St Kilda. Their understanding, or how they've explained it to me, is that there will always be street sex work for people who, for whatever reason, are not able to utilise the internet to run their business in that way. Street sex workers are often the most vulnerable people who, through addiction issues or mental health issues, are simply getting by day to day and are not able to run an online business, but are able to stand on the street and make a living that way. It's really important that we continue to work with these people and not just look at the online business. There are still people doing street sex work in St Kilda, and we need to make sure that they're well taken care of, and that's why decriminalisation is important for them too. Finally, I just want to finish up by saying that what we're looking at here is advocating for full decriminalisation. I know that there are a number of different ways to interpret this, and I know that some people will advocate for partial decriminalisation, a la the Nordic model or something like that. That does more harm, those partial decriminalisation models. We should be looking at full decriminalisation so that we can get to harm minimisation as quickly as possible, and that we can work with the workers to get there. So that's all I've got to say, and I commend the motion, and I hope you all vote for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I'll now put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? That motion's carried.
Do a division on that, Mayor, if that's okay.
Councillor Pearl has called a division, so I'll ask you all to vote again, please. All those in favour? Councillor Copsey, Councillor Simic, Councillor Brand, Councillor Voss, Councillor Gross, Councillor Crawford and Councillor Baxter. All those against? Councillor Pearl. That motion's carried.